recording, and we'll be posting this recording on the city website. We'll start off with just kind of a brief overview of the priority development area. Around 3:20, we'll move into just some higher level questions from attendees to kind of go over some of the items that Paul and I will be bringing up as part of the priority development area discussion. And then if we have time, starting around 3:40, we'll jump into some kind of high level framing questions that we have for you. We have quite a few attendees on the call right now. Normally, we had been asking everybody to give a quick little introduction, but with our number right now, I'm actually just going to read people's names off, just so everybody has an idea of who's on the call. I also just want everybody to bear with me a little bit. This is a new technology for all of us, so if I accidentally mute you or if I don't mute you, we're still trying to get through some of these technical glitches. So on the call right now, we have Bill Carney, Karan, Kenyao, Kathy Minovi, Cynthia Baez. We have Grace, we have Jeff Rhodes, Kate Powers, we have Kay, Ken, Lynn Dixon, Richard Hall, Sarah Laffer, and Shirley Fisher, and Wendy Sneerly. And I see I have a comment that came in as well, and I'll hit that before we jump in. And yes, you will have audio and chat when I turn it on for right now. We'll get to that in the Q&A, was one of the questions that just came in. And with that, I want to pass it over to Vice Mayor Collin if she wants to give a few words, and Paul to give a few words before we jump in.
Thank you, Ethan, although you look like Lindsay, so you just have to ignore that part of it. I just want to thank both Ethan and Paul for making these opportunities available, and to thank all of you who are on the call. It is definitely a challenge to do outreach and have these conversations while we're sheltering in place, and it is an opportunity to reach beyond and get new voices in there. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say at the end of the presentation.
So Ethan, I'm going to go ahead and get started here, unless you have something else to say.
That sounds great.
Okay, terrific. If you could move on to the next slide. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Jensen. I'm the Community Development Director for the city, and I've been working with Ethan on the priority development area topic, and actually quite a bit in the last week. And so what I'd like to do is to start with a little background because it's critical to where we are today and the topic area. And then I will turn it over to Ethan, and he'll go into further details about priority development areas and what we have in mind for the North San Rafael area. I think for the benefit of some of you who may not be familiar with City Planning 101 and the state of California and elsewhere, I'm going to start just by mentioning our general plan. Every city, town, and county in California is required to adopt a general plan. Essentially, that is a planning document that covers a 20-year period to forecast growth, infrastructure needs, service needs for the community, specific requests for particular areas, and is usually the jumping board for getting into details such as property zoning and major policy decisions by the city. We are operating under the General Plan 2020, which was adopted in 2004, and we are reaching that 2020 date. And so several years back, we decided to initiate our next General Plan update, which is General Plan 2040, taking us from 2020 to 2040. We have a 23-person steering committee of community members and stakeholders that are part of the General Plan 2040 process. We vet ideas, studies, plans, policies, programs with this committee through the course of the last almost 2 years now. And we are close to releasing the draft General Plan 2040 sometime this summer. During the course of this process, we reached out to all of the neighborhood organizations, neighborhood associations, homeowners associations, groups, particularly to take a look at one element of our general plan, which is called the neighborhood element. And contained in the neighborhood element is a discussion of each neighborhood in San Rafael and the city's planning area, and their unique conditions, their unique needs, context, and generally some things that are needed for that neighborhood. And through the course of that outreach, we received some very clear requests from North San Rafael residents and also from residents of the Canal and Southeast San Rafael area. And that request was for us to proactively program in our general plan, include a program that would commit the city to funding and completing a more detailed plan, like a specific plan or a precise plan or a neighborhood plan for these two particular areas. And coupled with that request was a request to make sure that those programs were listed as high priority in the general plan and that the city would actively seek funding. Well, timing to do this work and programming to fund an effort such as this requires funding certainty, and 9 times out of 10, it requires us to take a look at funding sources outside of our own internal city funding sources. We have a general plan maintenance fund, which is fed by building permit fees that help support our general plan 2040 and budgeting for that. But anything beyond that, we typically have to look at outside sources to find funding for like a deeper dive plan, such as the ones that we're talking about here. Probably the most recent example is the Downtown Precise Plan. This was funded by what's called an OBAG, or One Bay Area Grant. And this is linked back to it being designated as a priority development area. So this is the first time we're using this in this discussion today, the PDA. And so I want to make it clear that the money that we got for the Downtown Precise Plan was through that grant, and it was given to us and granted to us because of the priority development area designation. Ethan, could you move on to the next slide, please? What I'd like to cover briefly is what is a priority development area, its origins, etc. PDAs were established with the first Plan Bay Area in 2007. The Plan Bay Area is essentially the the regional plan for all of the 9 Bay Area counties that cover the Bay Area, and it is authored by and administered by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and ABAG, or the Association of Bay Area Governments. It is an aspirational plan. It takes a look at growth forecast over a 20-year period for the entire region. And prior to 2007, some of the rules changed on how regional plans were to be developed, and they were obligated to comply with the state law to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And coupled with that regional plan, they had these plans had to come up with sustainability measures to guarantee that greenhouse gas emissions for the region would be reduced over certain milestone periods of time. And one of the tools they developed to achieve this is the PDA, or the Plan Development Area tool. This is both a planning tool and a funding tool. The planning part of this tool is that it's intended to encourage concentrated growth in areas that are near transit for housing, jobs, and services. In addition, it's a funding tool, and we'll go into that in a few minutes, in that if an area or if a city or a county chooses to designate a priority development area, it provides us with a very strong guarantee for funding for planning within that area. Now, I'm going to mention that initially the Plan Bay Area 2007 defined a priority development area as a 1/2 mile radius around a rail station or transit center and stop. And in 2009, the city acknowledged this and applied for and received a designation for 2 PDAs for San Rafael, one in downtown, which we currently have, of course, and one in the Civic Center area. Both of these are 1/2 mile circle radius around the SMART station, and in downtown, it's the SMART station plus the transit center.
Hey, Paul, can I pause you real quick? We're getting a few chats that the audio might be in and out.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Well,
could could somebody just verify if our audio is working? Probably needs to unmute a person. Oh, I'm getting loud and clear.
okay. Shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay, fine. The PDA designations for both the downtown and the Civic Center allowed us to apply for and fully fund the downtown station area plan and the Civic Center station area plans, which were completed in 2011. There was a lot of controversy surrounding the station area plan for the Civic Center area because it included recommendations in certain areas that were extremely controversial. And as a result, in 2013, the city went back and amended that station area plan to scale back some of the recommendations and made a decision to remove or rescind the PDA for that area. So Ethan, could you move on to the next slide, please? So why would we consider this again, and what has changed since 2013? That was the first question I had when we first looked at this opportunity. And there have been some changes which we believe warrant a discussion of reconsidering priority development areas for San Rafael, specifically or in general. The first point is that the definition of PDAs has changed. As I mentioned to you, in 2007, they were defined as a specific circle around a transit center or a rail station. Now they are defined by eligible areas that are close to transit. And the best part of this is that it gives the local jurisdiction the opportunity to form the boundaries of the PDA. We have full discretion on how we want to form a PDA if we choose to request a designation. And they could be very small and compact, or they can cover a greater area. And Ethan will get into this in a few minutes. What has not changed is that designating a priority development area designation does not impact local zoning or land use authority. By state law, Plan Bay Area and PDAs are not given the right to have any oversight on local zoning or land use or land development authority. Also, we believe that the designation of a PDA would not prejudice our General Plan 2040. The other point I want to make is that there's no obligation to meet or zone for the Plan Bay Area. Plan Bay Area generally comes up with growth estimates for every community in the Bay Area, including an area for a PDA, but we are not obligated to meet any of those growth estimates. And I think that's very critical because there's always been a concern about this particular issue. The other point is we're in a housing crisis, and this is in line with the City Council's direction to staff for us to find opportunities to address the housing crisis and to look for opportunities for housing sites. And then lastly, I want to mention that, and this is a one-off because it's not really associated with Plan Bay Area, but does link back to our general plan. The state of California requires that our general plan housing element meet what's called a RHNA, or Regional Housing Need Allocation. And that's a housing allocation number that's given to us in 8-year cycles. And we're under a current cycle now that will terminate in 2022. And we expect that primarily because of the housing crisis in California, that RHNA allocation for San Rafael is going to jump. So we need to make sure that we keep this in mind and plan ahead for that. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ethan, and he's going to cover a little more about PDAs and then what we have looked at for the North San Rafael area.
Thanks, Paul. So one of the first questions that really comes up when we discuss PDAs, here, let me move my screen down so everybody can see, is what does a PDA designation commit the city to? So I think the first place to start is that the law that created the sustainable community strategies, it strictly says that the Plan Bay area or the similar documents have to be strategic. And it says that it shall not require a city's land use policies and regulations, including its general plan, to be consistent with the plan. So this kind of harkens back to Paul's comment in the slide before, why we don't need to plan for the growth strategies or the housing units that may come from Plan Bay Area 2050. And this law says explicitly that that Plan Bay area cannot influence our land use policies and regulations. What it does say, and this is what the Plan Bay Area 2050 process says, is that the PDAs must have a specific or a precise plan adopted by 2025 to maintain their PDA eligibility. So why is that eligibility important? It's because that eligibility is what gives us access to designated funding and resources to conduct a community-driven precise plan, our community-driven planning process. So what does that community-driven planning process look like? That's that specific or precise plan that we talk about. And that specific or precise plan does not need to plan for Plan Bay Area 2050. Additionally, that specific or precise plan does not need to be limited to the PDA area either. So a specific or a precise plan, for example, could be conducted for all of Terra Linda using the PDA designated funding, as long as the plan includes the Northgate PDA that we'll be talking about. Now, there's an important caveat here. The jurisdiction can change or rescind the PDA boundaries at any time. And why that's important is that part of the understanding about going through this process, the process that we're at the very beginning of, is that when we start looking at these PDA boundaries, they're likely to change when we get into a community-driven planning process. We may want to increase them, we may want to make them smaller. Whatever the community discussion is like, we would want to be able to reflect that in our PDA boundaries. So that's really important because while those boundaries may be updated immediately, the changes wouldn't necessarily be reflected until the next PDA update cycle, which is about every 4 years. So where are we now? So right now we're at this letter of interest process, the LOI process. The map to the left kind of shows you the areas that are considered PDA eligible areas, but may not have a designated PDA. The dark red circle around downtown San Rafael that's that 1/2 mile circle. I'm sorry, the 1/2 mile circle that Paul was referencing to the downtown PDA. But as you can see, there's some pink, there's some purple, there's some orange. These are all different levels of designation. And I'm happy to go through those more during the Q&A too. But where we are right now is MTC ABAG, the organization that's running the Plan Bay Area 2050, are currently accepting nominations of PDAs through this letter of interest. Now, that letter of interest was required to be submitted by May 31st, and it needed to be signed by the manager and planning director. But final authorization of that LOI submittal doesn't happen without a resolution that needs to be in place and adopted by June 30th for the nomination of a new PDA. Once that LOI has been submitted, it still needs to go for final approval at MTC and ABAG through their board. And they're likely not to consider these approvals until August, September. And finally, after the board's approval happens, it would be included in the Plan Bay Area analysis. It'd be included what's called this final blueprint analysis, which happens in approximately September. So where are we today? The City Council, they brought up on May 18th, and they considered a letter of interest. And they considered a letter of interest to submit for the Northgate and the Canal PDAs. Now, they did agree to submit that initial letter of interest, but they directed staff to conduct further outreach, which is part of why we're doing these virtual community meetings. Now, the final authorization, that authorizing resolution, that's still required to be submitted by the end of June. And that's the thing that finalizes the letter of interest submittal. And that is going to be brought to City Council on June 15th. Now, we've said this a few times, but we just want to reiterate it again. The big piece of a PDA designation is that it allows access to designated funding and resources to facilitate a community-driven planning process. This is something that through our general plan process and through other community processes, we've heard that this is of interest to this area, and it is part of the impetus for us moving forward with this letter of interest. So there's enough talk of me talking about the background of the PDA, so let's jump a little bit into the proposed Northgate PDA. This is the eligible area. And as you can see on the left, the eligible area is quite large. It's a large area ranging from immediately surrounding the Civic Center SMART train station and then following the path of the SMART train along Lincoln Avenue. Part of why there's interest in looking at a Northgate PDA is that the inclusion of the Northgate Mall area in the PDA would be consistent with general plan policies on the Northgate Mall. Additionally, Plan Bay Area 2050 is specifically trying to identify ways and strategies to transform aging malls and office parks into neighborhoods, which kind of falls in line with an idea of a town center that's been described in past community meetings that we've had. So the proposed Northgate PDA that was included in that letter of interest is on this map to the left. It includes Northgate Mall, Northgate 3, and the Northgate 1 Center. It also includes the Las Gallinas office and gas station areas. What it does not include is Mount Olivet Cemetery, the areas east of Highway 101, and the areas south and west of the Civic Center train station, immediately south and west of the Civic Center train station. So at this point, we've been talking for about 25 minutes. So I think it's time for us to open it up to everyone. Because we have so many people on the line, what I do ask is if you are interested or have a question, to please raise your hand. That'll allow me to moderate. And I also just want to apologize in advance if it's a little clunky at first to do the moderation. So I see, Grace, you already have your hand up. And so I'm going to click on allow to talk, and you should get a ping right now.
Yes, thank you. I just want to confirm that I understood this correctly based on the slides and what I had read in your previous staff report. So the PDA and the state, by us designating, it does not equal high density housing. It is up to the city and the local community and I guess developers to decide that. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that then, Paul, if you have anything to add. So the designation of a PDA in and of itself does not equal high density housing. By state law, the law that created the Plan Bay Area 2050 process, it states explicitly that those two things have to be separate. Now, what it does do is it helps provide funding for a specific or a precise plan. And those specific and precise plans are very detailed documents that look into everything. And that's a community-driven process. So that would be the thing that would discuss housing, the density, environmental impacts. That's the document. And they're separate, but what the PDA does is provide some funding for that. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I do want to add one clarification because this is a really good critical question. The original Plan Bay Area, the expectation for a PDA was for higher density within that area. And it was very clear in the information back then on Plan Bay Area, that was the intent. If you look at the definitions now for PDA in the Plan Bay Area document, it pretty much, and this is addressed, by the way, in the frequently asked questions that's listed on the website, that the intent of the PDA is to look at a range of housing types and densities and that a lot of that is determined based on the context of the area, based on local control. So I think that's real critical to remember, because originally there was an explicit statement about something more a higher density or intensity development.
Thank you. I'm just really happy to hear that, because there's just so much misinformation on, next door and just gossip. So I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks, Grace. Richard Hall, I see you have your hand up next. You should get a ping right now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I had a number of questions. First one, I'll keep them very precise, quick. The first one is, the city conducted a quiet zone engagement that was over 6 months with 6 meetings. And I'd like to understand how many people participated and spoke in those meetings. That was a lesser issue affecting people living near the tracks, not affecting essentially Terra Linda as a whole. And how many people have participated in these 3 Zoom meetings on this PDA matter by comparison? That's my first question. My second question is, definitions of PDAs has consistently shifted. It went from no strings attached in 2009 to a transit town center with 3,500 to 7,000 housing units in 2013, 2014, and now we're back to no strings attached. How are we to believe that any document, or is it in writing, that it won't change again, especially considering there are at least 4 major housing bills in Sacramento with streamlining and amplifying any local intent with zoning? And last question, why are we placing such expectations around transit and smart when smart is financially failing? It hasn't got the finances to sustain itself for any more than about 2 years. So why are we prioritizing development next to a failed transit system?
Thanks, Richard. I can take a stab at those first. So on your first question, result around quiet zone participation, these are apples and oranges. This is a letter of interest process. That's the very beginning of a community-based process. So this is just the initial steps. MTC ABAG currently has a deadline set on submitting letters of interest that's driven by their need to finish up the MTC analysis for the sustainable community strategies. So that's one of the main driving forces behind the need to kind of get a letter of interest in. Now, if we submit a letter of interest for a proposed PDA and it does get approved, that kicks off a much larger and longer community-based process that if we look at the Downtown Precise Plan, for example, is about 2 years. That is very detailed, very community driven, and includes a lot of, I think, the community discussion in which you're referencing. Additionally, for the definitions of PDAs, the state law that created the Sustainable Community Strategy hasn't changed. And that state law says explicitly that whatever comes from something like a Plan Bay area, it cannot influence local control and zoning. So the state law itself has not changed. And the state law is the specific thing that discusses the relationship between a PDA and zoning in and of itself. And then finally, regarding transit, again, it goes back to that state law, which is specifically aimed at trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's kind of the impetus behind the name Sustainable Community Strategies. So how they did that is by looking at things like bus frequencies, headways, relationship to a train station, but then also other areas, things like the TCAC, opportunity zones, is kind of this large word. But what that is describing is really many different factors in which a neighborhood or a census tract might provide high resources. So quality of schools, quality of jobs, density of jobs, environmental access, those sorts of things. Paul, I wasn't sure if you had anything more that you wanted to add.
No, I think you covered it, but Richard did have a question about transit and smart. that maybe you might be able to touch on with regard to how these areas are identified and based on, let's say, ridership or the use of smarts. So I don't know if you can expand on that. You know a little more about that than I do.
Yeah, so that refers back to what's called a transit-rich or a connected communities designation. And here, I'll go back a few slides to kind of show everyone. So that's, if you can kind of see my cursor, it's this undesignated PDA eligible areas. So the orange areas is what's called a transit-rich outside high resource area, but then there's also a transit-rich within high resource area. So the high resource areas, that was that TCAC opportunity zone. And we have a really good FAQ on the website that I recommend, if there's some kind of questions that you have that maybe we don't answer today, to also check out, because we try to get into the nitty gritty of a lot of this. But what that transit rich is really looking at is proximity to a train station. And then also it's looking at the peak headways. And it's defined right here at the bottom. This transit-rich and high-resource areas within a quarter mile of a bus stop, within 6 to 30-minute peak headway period headways. So it sounds like talking about the bus transit and frequency. Now, the connected communities are PDA eligible areas that fall outside of that proximity to a train station. So they may still have similar bus frequency and bus headways, but they still kind of fall within that category. Now, there's some weird things, obviously, like if you look along Lincoln Avenue, there's this kind of long strip, and that's qualifies because of its access to the smart train tracks, but it's definitely not something that we would want to include in our PDA eligible area, mostly because it includes most of just Highway 101. Great. So I see Kate Powers, you have a question, and I'm going to unmute you. You should have gotten a ping.
I just got it. Thank you. Yeah, I had a couple of questions similar to the canal area, but these are a little bit different. I'm wondering, my concern is about CEQA exemptions, and I am concerned about not the PDA, but the specific plan. And my research gathering has found that specific plans that have a certified EIR are exempt from CEQA. And so I was wondering if you could first just explain for this area specifically what the environmental review process attached to a specific plan will be. The second question I have is, in identifying the PDA locations, both in the Northgate area and in the canal area, I'm wondering if those two areas, in addition to the downtown PDA, qualify as meeting 50% of San Rafael's eligible acreage under the blueprint that Plan Bay Area 2050 is looking at. And what, if it does, what that advantages of doing that. And then the last question is, Ethan, you said that you can change a PDA or rescind boundaries at any time. I thought that it was every 4 years when the PDAs come back up for review. And just my last statement is concerned about identifying Northgate and the Civic Center area as transit rich, because the Smart Rail is a fixed track, single track, fixed rail system that really doesn't serve a lot of the population that needs and uses transit. I think our investment in Marin Transit would be better served by our tax dollars personally, because it can be flexible route. And so I just, attaching it to a station where it's the fare box is expensive, it doesn't really serve a lot of the people that need transit. And I was wondering if you could address that.
Definitely, Kate. I'll try to hit the last two questions, Paul, and then kick it over to you for the specifics of the precise
You want
plan.
me to go first with the question about the specific plan? I'd be happy to.
Sure. And just a heads up, I may be moving the screen around a little bit while you talk, everyone.
Sounds good. Okay, Kate, you have a very good question, and we've talked about this before. There's been a lot of questions about if an area is eligible for money for a specific plan, what does that mean? If we were to proceed with a specific plan, we'd have to do a detailed environmental impact report on that specific plan itself. It would not be tearing off of the general plan. It would have to be its own EIR. And because it covers a greater level of detail in terms of what it's entitling, usually it includes zoning and more granular land development allowances, the EIR correspondingly also has to be more detailed. So if a project, let's say, came in, so to answer your question is, no, just designating this area to qualify for a specific plan, the specific plan itself would not be exempt from CEQA. It would be subject to CEQA, and we would do an EIR. What happens afterwards is if we've got projects that are consistent with the specific plan, they may qualify for an exemption if the EIR adequately covers the impacts of that particular project. Now, there are some nuances to that because of the proximity to transit here. But the point is that the specific plan in itself would be subject to CEQA, and we would have to do a detailed EIR. Ethan, did you want to touch on the other items?
Yeah. And for an example of how detailed, before I jump into the last two, of how detailed the EIR has to be in relation to the specific plan, I would really recommend looking at the Downtown Precise Plan that's coming out. It's about a 400-page document, and the EIR has to look at the elements of that 400-page document.
And before you go on, I just want to clarify on that. We are coupling our Downtown Precise Plan with the General Plan 2040 effort. Both of them are subject to environmental review. A General Plan EIR is generally a high level, what we call a program level EIR, but because we're preparing one EIR to cover both the greater General Plan area and the downtown area, there are parts of that EIR that are far more detailed that cover our downtown area. And because we are required to do that under the California Environmental Quality Act. So while we're not doing a separate EIR for the Downtown Precise Plan, there is a greater level of detailed review that you should expect to see once this document is published that's for that specific area.
Thanks, Paul. So, Kate, on your question of PDA designation, that 50% threshold. So what that's referring to is how MTC looks at their analysis is they say, these are all the eligible PDA area within a jurisdiction. And we need to meet 50% of that designated area. Otherwise, they have some metrics that they use then to essentially run their analysis if a city doesn't nominate 50%. And so they'll just choose based upon these specific tracks as part of their analysis. Now, between the Northgate PDA, this downtown PDA, which is included within our 50% threshold, and the Southeast Santa Fe Canal PDA, we do meet that 50% threshold. We meet it by about, I think, 50 acres. So it's pretty close, but we do fall within that. And now in terms of the distinction and the distinguishing between what it will be considered, whether or not it's considered transit rich or a connected community, that has to do with the majority of the PDA area, whether or not it falls into transit rich or connected community. So for the Northgate PDA, we marked it as connected community. And if we do end up changing the boundaries, that's definitely going to be something that we are looking at, mostly because of the comments that we've received. So we're going to want to make sure that if we do move forward with the proposed PDA, that we're maintaining that 50% threshold, that still makes it a majority connected community PDA. So additionally, in terms of changing the boundaries and rescinding PDA boundaries and timing, I'm sorry if that was a little confusing. So the action to rescind or to change a boundary would be an immediate action. So we could say there could be an act of city council to rescind the PDA boundary, or as part of the community-driven planning process, we may decide to change those boundaries. That would be reflected immediately. What I was referring to is that the analysis that happens, like the actual somebody pressing a button to run analysis for Plan Bay Area, happens every 4 years. So that would be happening in September of this year. And the next time that they're going to press run on that analysis is going to be 4 years from September. So the next time that it would be reflected in the actual analytical process is in 4 years when they do that next update to Plan Bay Area. So we have a bunch of hands up, so I'm going to try to go down quickly. Lynn, you should hear a ping.
Hi, I'm trying very hard to follow all this since I'm not familiar with a lot of what you're talking about, but generally I think I get the idea. One of the things that confuses me is with what you're saying, how does it work that we're already trying to make decisions on who's going to take over Northgate Mall and housing by the gas station in that area, if you're talking about a plan that hasn't been developed yet? So I'm kind of confused about how all this fits together.
Oh, wow, that's a good question for me, Ethan. I'm going to tackle that.
Good.
First of all, we have our current general plan, which covers the entire city, and then we have property zoning for every property within the city. And I noticed Kathy Minovi asked the question. I just came up, this may be random, but it is relevant, about when you refer to jurisdiction, what does that mean? It means this area within the city of San Rafael, by the way. But we, as you know, and as you experienced living in this area, the couple of projects have come along and have been processed individually, and property owners have come in and they've asked for land development approvals, whether it's Northgate Walk or a preliminary proposal for Costco. They have that right to make that request. What we heard from the community and why we got this request for the specific plan is, you know, while we acknowledge that these folks can come in and propose development on their individual sites, we would rather see a bigger plan for the whole area developed so that we have a greater understanding on what to expect. So that's why we're looking at this as an opportunity, is to pursue that request. But right now, at any time, whether it's Merlone Geyer or whether it's the folks that own Northgate 3, could come in and make a request to do something on their property. If they're consistent with zoning, if they're consistent with the general plan, they go through our normal public process, which is what you've experienced with these other projects.
Okay, great.
I see we have Bill Carney. Your hand is up. I'm going to unmute you.
Yep. Okay. Am I okay?
You're good.
Okay. So I'm wondering if you guys could address sort of the problems that you see this planning process addressing, and you know, how it would assist in that. And specifically, you know, I would suggest that there are at least 3 nested problems that apply very much to the Northgate area. The first would be the housing crisis, and housing as an issue which is increasingly confronting us, and I think has grown dramatically since the last time this area was seriously looked at. And secondly, of course, the climate crisis continues and continues to intensify. And ways of dealing with that are still very much in the forefront of the city's interest. And I think related to that, just now we're seeing environmental justice and health and air quality issues related to the climate issue as well. So that's the second one. And the third and final one is the economy and economic impacts. Arguably right now we're in an economic crisis. Retail has been in economic transition, dramatic economic transition for a longer period of time. So those three things, and I'd be interested in your addressing those. And then I also wanted to touch a little bit and hear your answer to how will the current ownership of property, particularly the big property of Northgate Mall and Northgate 3, which is one ownership, how will that be engaged in this planning process? You've got over half of the territory in a single ownership. That seems like a huge opportunity to plan in a way that might actually plan something that might actually get accomplished. Thank you.
Well, Ethan, I think I'm going to start with what problems do we think this might solve? I think there's a whole, and not all of these are problems, but really more situational. And where we are right now in the North San Rafael area, I think one of the problems is we've got a failing mall. And as Ethan had mentioned, PDA designation, which offers some funding opportunities, can now allow us to take a look at that and find some other solutions. The other thing that I think is really important and is that we have done many plans for this North San Rafael area. We've had the Vision North San Rafael, which is a vision. The one tangible item that came out of that was part of a promenade. We've had the station area plan, which was a vision document. We had the Northgate Activity Center plan back in the 1980s, which strictly dealt with the circulation network. None of that stuff has ever been packaged up into one sort of planning and regulatory framework for this area. So this is an opportunity to sort of bring that all together, much like what we're doing in downtown, where we had the same set of circumstances, a station area plan, a vision from the 1980s, and a parking study that was done more recently. I think it's also an opportunity to look at just the bigger picture. And I think you are correct, Bill, that with there being sort of a large single landowner, that makes for, I think, a unique opportunity here for us to be able to collaborate with them. And so that's what I have to add to this. Ethan, do you have anything else to add?
I think that hits on it. I just wanted to do a quick little time check. We have about 10 minutes and we have 4 hands up right now. So I'm going to try to move us on to the next question. Let's see, Grace, you've had your hand up for a while.
This is quick. The money that we might get, or the money that maybe you got in 2013, we don't have to, from a PDA, we don't have to return that, correct? I mean, if we decide to call it quits in 2022, whatever we've gotten from the PDA funding, we get to keep. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I'm going to sort of cover the first part of that and then turn it over to Ethan because he did some follow-up with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission on this. This same issue came up during the station area plan process in Civic Center when the city decided to remove the PDA. And that was, are we going to have to return the $250,000 that was used to prepare that plan? And the answer was no, we did not. And primarily because we went ahead and accepted that plan with some major modifications. In fact, some of those modifications are already being added to our general plan 2040, the ones that were deemed acceptable by the community. And Ethan, I know that you had a follow-up communication with MTC on this.
Yep, and the clarification that I got from MTC is that the ability to apply for the grant requires a PDA designation. So we wouldn't be able to apply without the designation. But if we've been awarded a grant, it's actually the terms of the grant that itself that says whether or not a grant money would have to be returned. So what I mean by that, and the example that was given to me, was that in almost all of those grant applications, it's deliverable based. So it's based on, we're giving you X amount of dollars for a plan. And so at the end of it, you need to provide us a plan. Now, if in the process you lose your PDA or rescind your PDA eligibility, that doesn't affect the need to have that deliverable of a plan. So there's been no instance that they could provide that somebody's been asked to return any money associated with funding from grants.
Great.
And Lynn, sorry, Grace, I accidentally muted you a little bit too quick. Lynn, you're up next. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one. Greg, now you've had your hand up for a while.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Greg.
Hi. I understand the current PDA environment is not designed to encourage high density. However, online there are some chosen quotes, choice quotes from Paul, from sitting council member Kate Collin, about how they're in favor of what the poster term stack and pack, and your intent to force high density, and this was 2013. So despite the law, I'd like to get clarification from community planning and Paul himself. Those comments, I'm sure you've seen posted today from 2013, are you still intent on pushing high density on the community?
Oh boy, I never was, to be honest with you.
Well, when you pick quotes, you can kind of take them out of context.
That might be.
Nor was I. Sorry, I have to jump in. I love that out of context kind of behavior, but I'm glad you're here to ask the question for clarity.
Yeah, exactly. I never was. I mean, I think there were certain expectations at the time by MTC and ABAG on what they would have expected out of a PDA process. But I think Ethan made it very clear we are not obligated to do, to put high density anywhere. In fact, now the definition for PDA acknowledges a range of densities and intensities. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be high density. So no, and I'm a North San Rafael resident too. I've worked for the city on and off for 40 years, and this is my home. I'm not one that is supporting stack and pack housing in this particular area, and that's certainly not the intent here. And we're proceeding with this primarily because it's an opportunity to fund a plan that we get to create on our own, community based, which means the community can influence how much, how high, how dense is appropriate for this area. And I don't think we could do that without being able to get funds to prepare a plan to do that.
Yeah, Paul, and if I just may add, we found in San Rafael that infill housing has been most successful, and even when housing has been approved, it hasn't already been built. And I don't know the exact figures, but I think it is something like over 100 units have been approved. We built 10 or 300 units. And so we have an issue in San Rafael of having an environment to have the right projects proposed, and then to have them actually delivered and built according to our community values. So I'm glad again, Greg, that you asked the question, and to provide clarity to the community. That was 7 years ago too, and the landscape has changed, but the part about having the community involved in the conversation and needing to do better and have additional housing units, that part hasn't changed.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity to get this planning money. I was on the vision committee 20 years ago, and on the Mace Rich negotiating team that got the traffic study. And, so I have complete confidence in the planning staff, but I just wanted to hear from you guys about this because it's going around, and thank you for answering about your own personal opinions on this project. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. So sorry to kind of speed us along a little bit. So I'm just going to put these questions up to read while we have time for, I think, one more question. But take a look at these three questions for the feedback. Feel free to email Paul or I, to submit online, to kind of give us your thoughts on any of these three. And Lynn, I see your hand is up again, so I'm going to try to give you. Let's see if we can get you on, because I know you've had a question for a while.
Thank you very much. I did post it to chat. In the intro, it was mentioned that we're in a housing crisis. From so much I've seen in the news, that might be in a state of flux. San Francisco rents are down 9%, maybe temporarily, maybe not. Large tech companies are saying they're going to continue to have their people work from home post-COVID. 40% of tech workers said if they can work from home, they'll leave the Bay Area when polled by, I think it was San Jose Mercury News. So I'm feeling that the housing crisis, that bubble may burst at some time, and I would hate to see a lot of, gearing up to build housing to accommodate a crisis that has passed.
Thanks, Len. So I think the quick response to that, because I know we're at time, is that the purpose of the priority development area designation is really to help fund a community-driven planning process, which would want to take into consideration those kinds of fluctuations. So nothing's happening tomorrow. This process likely wouldn't even really begin in earnest for another 3 to 4 months. After Plan Bay Area 2050's final blueprint is released. I think the last information that we've received from MTC is that the grant period doesn't even open until September, October. So I think your point is a good one in that we don't know what the future is going to lead to. So we don't want to necessarily make any decisions short term for when a long-term decision might be more important. I see some more hands up, and I'm really sorry, but we are out of time. I do just want to give Vice Mayor Collin and Paul an opportunity to speak last before I close up. But I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for taking the time to spend this afternoon.
And Ethan, I want to ask, do we have the ability once, since this is recorded, will we also be able to see the chat and the questions that have come in? Because there's been, I've been tracking some of the questions, which are very good, that I think we might want to respond to outside this forum here today.
Yeah, well, I'll be working on dictating those and getting them up as fast as possible.
Okay, that sounds good, because I'd like to do that. One thing I just want to mention, which was very interesting, is to encourage everyone to look at the frequently asked questions. Interestingly, when we did this back in 2013, when the city decided to remove the Civic Center PDA, we had 50 pages of Q&A. So we knew that there was going to be a lot of questions on this. And again, look at the web page, because there have been a lot of questions that have been raised by a lot of people, really good, and they're very granular. But one was really hit home to me today that we received and we've responded to on that. And that is, what has been the city experience with the downtown PDA? What are the advantages? What have been the accomplishments? And what have been the downfall or the disadvantages to this PDA? And I urge you to take a look at that, because I think that's really good. We have an example right now. We benefited from a lot of money to prepare 2 plans, infrastructure and roadway improvements that were funded by OBAG grants and others. And there has been really no downside at all. We haven't had Big Brother at the regional planning level come down at us and tell us what to put in our downtown precise plan. And it's been 100% locally prepared and locally controlled. And so I think that's just a good example and to keep in mind. And I'm glad that that question was raised and we had an opportunity to respond to it.
And Paul, I realize we're over, and I see one of the questions that Kay had asked about equity and housing, and I'm not going to go into answering that question, although it does highlight that we're in a different place than we were in 2013. And I'm really grateful that the community is coming along, not with preconceived ideas of where we were, but where it is we want to go, and recognizing the challenges we have, everything from COVID to the very real issues we have about equity. So, more to come. There are no hard and fast decisions being made about development in any part of San Rafael, but we need everybody to be a part of the conversation. So again, appreciate all of you, 19 people being on this call, and Ethan and Paul for all the work you've done and for the frequently asked questions. Shout out to that. If you have any other questions, it's probably answered there. Thank you.